Hey, what's going on? This is my fourth video in this TypeScript design patterns video. So thankfully, I haven't let up. I'm still trying to crank out these videos at the same time, still trying to learn about these design patterns and learn a little bit about TypeScript as well. So this pattern is called the factory method pattern. And so this pattern is um, focused on like creating objects, classes, subclasses, and being able to create a level of abstraction where we're not creating objects concretely within our program, application, or situation, but we're allocating the creation of these objects to something called a factory using some method to create these objects as well. Now, that seems kind of straightforward. It is a little bit straightforward, but I guess the key component to understanding the purpose and design of this pattern is understanding a bit of having that layer of abstraction will allow us to have these objects that we're trying to focus on creating maybe dynamically for some specific purpose and having our application itself, maybe the logic, the code, or something within our program that may require these objects. And we're kind of separating the two. Once we create that layer of abstraction, we're able to in the future maybe add on to these objects, add on to these factories that create these objects without necessarily conflicting or affecting or modifying the code itself, which is super useful in terms of scaling things out. And back to that principle that was kind of discussed in the adapter pattern is talking about that open close principle, having something that's open to expansion but closed to modification on that base logic and base code. So we're just going to kind of dig into an example and kind of I'll highlight a little bit more of that relationship and the purposes of this design pattern. This is some back end client server request, HTTP request. We're going to have some requests that we're sending out to some server. And so as we send it up to the server, we're going to get some response code. Like it's going to have some code. It's going to have some. We're just translating this so we understand what that code means. The 404 is obviously not found. And so we're going to get back from our client side some response that we have created from this response code. And so 200 is okay. So that's going to give us the response in the article that we're trying to create for our web page. And 503 means the service is unavailable. And then sometimes we might get a 511, which will be the network. There's a security issue. And as we're getting these requests, we're going to create some web page that we have down here. So this is, we're just imagining that this is a user. They're able to see their web page through these requests that are given. So we're using the factory pattern itself to create the web page itself through having this ability to account for these different codes, these response codes that are given by the server. And so even if there is some issue that's being logged, we're actually accounting for that with our code. So we have some array that's a logger that's going to log these codes, which we've already logged the dates, the codes, and the security issues here. And so if there is an issue where there isn't a response, maybe the content is not found at all, then through these factories, we're able to create a default page. So this is the default page that we've created for that situation that maybe no content or no information is given from the server. So we're able to have some default or base object, in our case, the web page, to account for that. And if there is some issue like security, then we can account for that as well. And so let me see. And so the content is being reported, is still being posted through these service unavailable codes, but we're logging this issue as well through our code. And I'm just going to show you the code right here. And so in our code, the top part is just kind of me just randomly generating some content, response number, some article. So a lot of this top part is not necessarily important. It is important to kind of think about, though, that we have some object that these factories are creating, and that object we want to have some extraction, some composition. We're coding towards that composition. So we have a web page that we have some interface for. And then we also have the interface for this web page generator. And that's our factories. And we're actually going to be coding and changing this method. That's the create web page. And that's where the factory method name comes from. So we have these different factories that are going to change the way that it implements this method by also changing the output of this web page as well. And so we're going to focus on just the next 4 classes here. And these are all web pages that we've created for this specific situation and circumstance. And once we do this, we notice that there is a default object or web page that we can create, and we have this object in mind for those situations or those circumstances. Like for this web page request, there's a 404, there's no object, or it can't be found. And so we have to still instantiate some object, and so we have some default one that's created. And sometimes it might be useful for your situation, that you might need some default object to account for those situations that maybe there could be some issue in your code that might potentially block your entire code if it's not handled. So we can have a factory create some object so your program doesn't block or hold off because some object isn't instantiated. And at the same time, we have the security web page that is also going to be used to kind of highlight that, hey, there's a security issue here if this web page is instantiated, or hey, this web page is for services. So, and the content is just the normal content web page. It's not too crucial. So we have next the 3 ways. These are kind of the factories that we're using to instantiate those objects. And the content web page response factory has its own implementation of that create web page. And through this implementation, we mark that if there is the 404 code, create that default page. Otherwise, you can just create the content with that response that we use here. If there is a security issue, though, with those codes, the 511, the 503, then in addition to creating those objects, we also want to log in through this function logger, which is going to kind of record the code, the time. We're also saying create this object, but also log the time because of this issue. And at the end, we also have some overarching factory that we are also embedding these two factories within. So it's like the factories are going to be inside a main factory that will kind of create the web page itself. I don't know if this is mandatory because through all my reading, through all my research, I've noticed this sometimes. I've noticed this in other situations that they don't do this. I did this more because I think it is a little bit convenient, a little bit easier too, to have all the factories within some larger factory that can kind of parse through and create the specific object that you need, but I don't know. I might change this in the future, but I don't think it's super mandatory. The most important part of this pattern to understand is that all of these patterns have this factory method of creating that object. And as it creates that object, they all individually have a different instantation or different way that it's creating these different objects. And so with that, we're going to kind of yeah. I think that's pretty much it. It's just pretty straightforward. I think the most crucial part is also understanding that with this way that this is created in code, with that layer of abstraction, it doesn't take much effort to continue to add on more web pages or more factories that are kind of connected together, maybe in terms of their responsibilities. Like this content web response, we kind of embed or kind of connect all of the web pages that are kind of related to each other in terms of they all have some content or they all are centered around just pushing these articles or whatever. And all the security web page responses are connected together to record some issues within our program or application. And as we kind of couple these objects together that are related together, this can kind of help in the future for maybe maintenance. Like if there is some issue with the logger or if there is some issue that comes up with the content, it becomes much quicker and easier to isolate where the potential problem is in terms of our code, because we understand that, okay, this object didn't output correctly, or there is something wrong in terms of the relationship between the application and the object, and we can isolate, oh, this code came up and this object was not correctly instantiated, so we can find the factory, find the method that created the object, and we can kind of center and narrow down our search instead of going through an entire logic and figuring out bit by bit, is it the problem with the logic? Is it the problem with the object? Where did the issue come from? And so we can isolate more specifically the particular area that the issue came from. So that was pretty much it. I think it's not too difficult to wrap your head around, and I don't think it would be hard to understand the context where you need this. So understanding that factories are made so we don't couple too much of the application and the creation of the objects together, so it's easier to expand out. But also another key component of this pattern is knowing that we are focused specifically on that factory method. So our concern is just on instantiating objects themselves, because there's another pattern called abstract factory, which is centered and focused on the creation of those factories that instantiate the objects for specific purposes. And so we're under the assumption that we know the objects themselves and we know what we want to instantiate. But we do not know when we might need these objects. So we have this pattern here. But if there is something that we don't know what these objects are and we don't know the concrete implementation, then that would need the abstract factory. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I definitely have my code in GitHub in the description and a lot more information, and I've updated all of my readmes. I made it a lot more organized, so hopefully that makes it much easier to understand the code, understand these patterns. So I just wanted to make it super clear on everything that wasn't explained and all the nuances that I think are important in terms of using and understanding these patterns. So thanks for watching, and hope you guys have a nice one.